The morning mist hung heavy over the village of Sloviansk when Maria Petrov stepped outside her small house to tend to her garden. At 62, she had weathered many storms in eastern Ukraine, but nothing could have prepared her for what was coming. The year was 2014, and whispers of conflict were growing louder each day. Maria lived alone since her husband Victor had passed 3 years earlier. Her only daughter, Anya, lived in Kiev with her 2 children, constantly begging Maria to leave the village and join them in the capital. But this land was all Maria knew. Her grandmother had planted the apple trees in her yard. Her mother had taught her to preserve vegetables in the small cellar beneath the house. Every stone, every path, every neighbor held memories that she could not abandon. The village had always been quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Children played in the dusty streets while their mothers hung laundry on lines stretched between houses. Old men gathered in the town square each afternoon to play chess and argue about politics. Life moved at the pace of the seasons, predictable and steady, but lately things had been different. Strange vehicles had been spotted on the roads leading into town. Young men with unfamiliar accents had been asking questions at the local market. The electricity had been cutting out more frequently, and phone signals were becoming unreliable. Most troubling of all, several families had quietly packed up and left in the middle of the night, leaving their homes empty and their gardens untended. Maria tried to push these concerns from her mind as she worked among her tomato plants. The vegetables needed her attention, and worry would not make them grow any faster. She had survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, the economic chaos of the 1990s, and the Orange Revolution. Whatever was coming, she would face it as she always had, with quiet determination and faith that tomorrow would be better than today. As she knelt in the dirt, pulling weeds from around her potato plants, Maria heard the sound of heavy vehicles approaching. The rumble grew louder, causing windows in nearby houses to rattle. She stood up slowly, brushing soil from her hands, and walked to the wooden fence that bordered her property. What she saw made her blood run cold. A convoy of military trucks was rolling down the main road through the village. But these were not Ukrainian soldiers. The vehicles bore no flags, no identifying marks. The men inside wore unmarked green uniforms and carried automatic weapons. Their faces were hard and serious, scanning the houses and yards as they passed. Maria watched in silence as the convoy stopped in the town square. Armed men jumped out and began setting up what looked like a checkpoint. They erected barriers across the main road and positioned vehicles to control all traffic in and out of the village. Within an hour, their quiet farming community had been transformed into something that resembled a military occupation. That evening, Maria tried to call her daughter in Kiev, but the phone lines were dead. She attempted to send a text message from her old mobile phone, but there was no signal. The feeling of isolation was immediate and terrifying. For the first time in her life, she could not reach the outside world. Neighbors began gathering in small groups, speaking in hushed voices about what they had witnessed. Some talked about leaving immediately, but others argued that this was just a temporary situation that would resolve itself quickly. The older residents remembered similar disruptions during previous political upheavals and counseled patience. Maria spent that first night lying awake in her bed, listening to the sound of boots marching past her house and the occasional roar of military vehicles. Through her bedroom window, she could see searchlights sweeping across the village, casting moving shadows on her walls. The apple trees in her yard, which had always provided comfort and shelter, now seemed to offer places for armed men to hide. By the third day, the situation had become more serious. The armed men had established a permanent presence in the village center and were demanding to see identification papers from anyone who wanted to enter or leave. Food deliveries had stopped coming from the regional center, and the small local market was beginning to run low on basic supplies. More families began to leave, loading their possessions into cars and trucks in the early morning hours before the armed men were fully alert. Each departure left another empty house, another abandoned garden, another gap in the community that had been Maria's entire world. But Maria remained. She continued to tend her garden, to preserve her vegetables, and to maintain her daily routines as if normalcy could be sustained through sheer willpower. When neighbors asked why she did not flee like the others, she would simply say that this was her home, and that she was too old to start over somewhere else. The truth was more complicated. Maria had nowhere to go and no means to leave. Her small pension was barely enough to cover her daily needs, and she had no savings to support a new life elsewhere. More importantly, she feared that if she left, she would never be able to return. The house and land represented not just her present security, but the legacy of generations of her family. As the days passed, the presence of armed men became more oppressive. They began conducting house-to-house searches, looking for weapons or anything they deemed suspicious. They questioned villagers about their political beliefs and their connections to the Ukrainian government. Anyone who expressed pro-Ukrainian sentiments was taken away for questioning at a facility that had been established in the old community center. Maria watched these developments with growing dread, but she kept her thoughts to herself. She had learned long ago that survival sometimes required silence, that speaking one's mind could be a luxury that ordinary people could not afford. She continued her daily routines, tended her garden, and waited for this nightmare to end. What she did not know was that this was only the beginning. The occupation of her village was part of a larger conflict that would consume the entire region. Soon, the sounds of distant artillery would echo across the fields, and the night sky would glow with the fires of burning towns. The quiet farming community where she had spent her entire life was about to become a battlefield. But Maria Petrov was stronger than she knew, and her story was far from over. In the months to come, she would discover reserves of courage and resilience that she never knew she possessed. She would find ways to help her neighbors and resist the occupation, even as the world around her descended into chaos and violence. The woman whom everyone would eventually count as lost or dead was just beginning to fight back. 3 weeks after the armed men arrived, the first shells began falling on the outskirts of Sloviansk. Maria was hanging laundry in her backyard when she heard the distinctive whistle, followed by a thunderous explosion that shook the ground beneath her feet. The blast was so powerful that several of her preserving jars fell from the shelf in her kitchen and shattered on the floor. The fighting had finally reached their village. What had started as an occupation was now becoming a war zone. The armed men who had controlled the town square began digging trenches and setting up heavy weapons. They commandeered houses with good sightlines and forced families to evacuate at gunpoint. Maria watched from her window as the Kozlov family, who had lived 3 houses down for over 20 years, were given 15 minutes to gather their belongings before being ordered to leave. The artillery exchanges grew more frequent over the following days. Sometimes the shells came from the east, sometimes from the west, as different forces fought for control of strategic positions around the village. Maria learned to recognize the different sounds: the incoming whistle that meant she should take cover, the outgoing boom that meant the occupied forces were firing back, and the distant rumble that meant the battle was moving closer or farther away. During the worst bombardments, Maria would retreat to her cellar, the same underground space where her mother had stored potatoes and canned vegetables. Now it served as her bunker, a place where she could wait out the shelling while praying that her house would still be standing when the noise stopped. She brought down blankets, candles, and whatever food she could carry, creating a makeshift shelter that became her second home. But even in the cellar, Maria was not safe from the occupation forces. They began conducting more aggressive searches, looking for anyone they suspected of communicating with Ukrainian military forces or providing information to the outside world. Several villagers had already been accused of being spotters and people who supposedly signaled the positions of occupied forces to Ukrainian artillery units. The accusations were often based on the flimsiest evidence. Old Pavel Marchenko was arrested because someone saw him looking through binoculars at birds in his garden. The soldiers claimed he was actually conducting surveillance. Anna Kravchenko was taken away because she had a radio in her kitchen, which the occupiers said she was using to send coded messages. Both neighbors disappeared into the makeshift detention center, and neither was seen again. Maria realized that her own activities could easily be misinterpreted. She had been keeping a detailed diary of events, recording the times of artillery attacks, the movements of military vehicles, and the behavior of the occupation forces. Originally, she had started writing simply to maintain her sanity, to create some record of the madness that was consuming her world. But she understood that if the armed men found her notebook, they would certainly view it as evidence of espionage. She began hiding the diary in different locations around her property, burying it in waterproof containers beneath her vegetable garden, or concealing it inside the walls of her chicken coop. Each time she moved it, she felt like a resistance fighter. Even though she had no contact with any organized opposition and no way to share her observations with the outside world, the isolation was becoming unbearable. The occupied forces had cut all communication lines and were jamming radio signals. No newspapers were being delivered, no television broadcasts were getting through, and mobile phone networks had been completely shut down. Maria had no way to contact her daughter in Kiev, no way to learn what was happening in the rest of Ukraine, and no way to call for help if she was injured or became sick. Food was also becoming a serious problem. The local market had been closed for over a week, and the small store where villagers bought basic supplies had run out of most items. The occupation forces had requisitioned whatever food they wanted from remaining residents, often at gunpoint. Maria's garden was providing some vegetables, but she was running low on bread, milk, and other staples. More troubling was the behavior of some villagers who had chosen to collaborate with the occupiers. These people, desperate to protect themselves and their families, began providing information about their neighbors. They pointed out houses where they thought weapons might be hidden, identified people who had expressed pro-Ukrainian sentiments, and reported any suspicious activities they observed. Maria watched in horror as her community turned against itself. People who had been friends for decades began viewing each other with suspicion and fear. Children were afraid to play outside because they might accidentally say something that could be interpreted as disloyal. Elderly residents stopped gathering in the town square because any conversation might be seen as conspiracy. The psychological pressure was enormous. Maria found herself constantly second-guessing her actions, wondering if something as innocent as watering her plants at a particular time of day might be misinterpreted as a signal. She stopped writing in her diary for several days, paralyzed by the fear that someone might be watching her every move. But gradually, a different kind of determination began to grow within her. She started to realize that the occupation forces were using fear as their primary weapon, that they were trying to break the spirit of the community by making everyone afraid to think, speak, or act independently. She understood that giving in to this fear would mean allowing them to win without even fighting. Maria began to find small ways to resist. She continued keeping her diary, but now she wrote it as much for future historians as for her own sanity. She started leaving small portions of food outside her gate, where hungry neighbors could find them without being seen taking charity. She developed a system of subtle hand signals that allowed her to communicate basic information to other villagers without speaking aloud. Most importantly, she began to pay closer attention to the occupation forces themselves. She noticed patterns in their behavior, weaknesses in their security, and inconsistencies in their stories about what they were doing and why they were there. This information might be useless to her now, but she sensed that someday it might become important. As winter approached, the situation continued to deteriorate. The fighting intensified, with battles raging just a few kilometers from the village center. Several houses had been destroyed by artillery strikes, and the local medical clinic had been abandoned when the doctor fled with his family. The occupation forces were becoming more paranoid and brutal, executing villagers on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. But Maria Petrov endured. She survived on vegetables from her garden, rainwater collected in buckets, and an iron determination not to let the occupiers destroy her spirit. She continued writing her diary, documenting the crimes she witnessed and the suffering of her neighbors. She maintained her small acts of resistance, knowing that preserving her humanity was itself a form of victory. What she did not know was that her story was about to take an unexpected turn. Events were being set in motion that would transform her from a passive victim into an active participant in the resistance. The skills she was developing and the knowledge she was gathering would soon make her far more important than anyone could have imagined. The stranger appeared at Maria's gate on a cold November morning, just as the first snow was beginning to fall. She was in her garden, harvesting the last of her winter carrots, when she noticed someone watching her from the shadows of the abandoned house across the street. For a moment, her heart raced with fear. Had the occupation forces sent someone to spy on her? But as the figure approached, she could see it was a young woman, perhaps 25 years old, with dark hair and tired eyes. She was wearing civilian clothes that were dirty and torn, and she moved with the careful caution of someone who had been hiding for a long time. When she reached the gate, she spoke in a whisper that barely carried across the small distance between them. Are you Maria Petrov? The woman asked, glancing nervously up and down the empty street. Maria nodded slowly, unsure whether she should admit her identity or deny it. The young woman continued, speaking in urgent, hushed tones. My name is Katya. I was sent by your daughter Anya. She is desperately trying to find out if you are still alive. The whole family thinks you might be dead. The words hit Maria like a physical blow. For months, she had been completely cut off from her family, unable to send any message that would let them know she had survived. She had assumed they understood that communication was impossible, but of course, they would fear the worst. Her daughter must be going through hell, not knowing whether her mother was alive or dead. Katya explained that she was part of an informal network of people who were trying to maintain contact between occupied territories and the rest of Ukraine. Some were professional journalists, others were aid workers, and many were just ordinary citizens who felt compelled to help families stay connected during the chaos of war. They moved through dangerous areas on foot, carrying messages and information that could not be transmitted through normal channels. I can take a letter to your daughter, Katya offered, but I need to warn you that this is extremely dangerous. If the occupation forces catch me with messages, they will execute me as a spy. And if they find out you gave me information, they will do the same to you. Maria did not hesitate. The chance to let her daughter know she was alive was worth any risk. She invited Katya into her house, where they sat in the kitchen while Maria quickly wrote a letter describing her situation. She kept the message deliberately vague, mentioning that she was well and staying in the family home, but avoiding any details that might be useful to military forces if the letter was intercepted. As she wrote, Katya told her more about the situation in the rest of Ukraine. The conflict had spread across much of the eastern region, with thousands of people killed and hundreds of thousands forced to flee their homes. International attention was focused on the crisis, but most of the outside world had little understanding of what daily life was like for civilians trapped in occupied territories. People need to know what is happening here, Katya said. The occupation forces are committing terrible crimes, but there are very few witnesses who can document what they are doing. Most journalists cannot get into these areas, and most residents are too afraid to speak openly. Maria thought about the diary she had been keeping, hidden in various locations around her property. For months, she had been recording detailed observations about the occupation forces, their weapons, their movements, and their treatment of civilians. She had documented executions, torture, theft, and intimidation. At the time, she had no clear purpose for this information, but now she began to see how it might be valuable. I have been writing down everything I see, she told Katya carefully. I have records of what these men are doing to our village. Katya's eyes lit up with interest. This was exactly the kind of first-hand testimony that human rights organizations and international investigators desperately needed. Most evidence of war crimes was being destroyed or suppressed by the occupation forces, making it nearly impossible to build legal cases against those responsible. Would you be willing to share some of that information? Katya asked. I know people who work with international organizations. They could use your testimony to help the world understand what is really happening here. Maria felt a surge of fear and excitement. For months she had felt powerless, a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Now she was being offered a chance to fight back, to transform her suffering into something that might help others. But she also understood the enormous risks involved. If the occupation forces discovered that she was providing information to outside organizations, they would certainly execute her. But if she remained silent, the crimes she had witnessed would never be documented, and the perpetrators would never be held accountable. After a long moment of consideration, Maria made her decision. She told Katya where she had hidden copies of her diary and explained her system for recording events. She provided specific examples of war crimes she had witnessed, including dates, times, and the names of victims when she knew them. Katya carefully copied this information into her own notebook, using a code that would make it meaningless to anyone who intercepted it. She explained that the information would be smuggled out of the occupied territory and provided to international human rights organizations, prosecutors investigating war crimes, and journalists working to expose the truth about the conflict. You are taking an enormous risk by helping us, Katya warned. but you are also performing an incredible service. Most people will never know what you are doing, but your testimony could help save lives and bring justice for the victims. Before leaving, Katya taught Maria some basic security procedures. She showed her how to hide sensitive materials more effectively, how to communicate using coded language, and how to recognize signs that she might be under surveillance. Most importantly, she gave Maria a system for making contact if she had urgent information to share. After Katya disappeared into the snowy landscape, Maria felt transformed. She was no longer just a victim of occupation. She had become a witness, a recorder of history, and a participant in the resistance. The work was dangerous, but it gave her life new meaning and purpose. Over the following weeks, Maria became more systematic in her observations. She began mapping the positions of weapons and fortifications, noting the names and ranks of occupation force leaders, and documenting their supply routes and communication systems. She developed a more sophisticated hiding system for her records, creating multiple copies and storing them in different locations. The psychological impact was profound. Instead of feeling helpless and afraid, Maria now felt that she was actively fighting against the forces that had destroyed her community. Every detail she recorded was a small victory. Every hidden document was an act of defiance. But the work also brought new dangers. The occupation forces were becoming increasingly paranoid about security leaks, and they were conducting more frequent and thorough searches. Maria had several close calls when soldiers searched her house, forcing her to quickly hide or destroy sensitive materials. She also began to notice that she was being watched more carefully. Neighbors who had been friendly before now seemed suspicious of her activities. Some were probably just afraid of being associated with anyone who might be viewed as disloyal, but others might be actively reporting on her behavior to the occupation forces. Despite these risks, Maria continued her work. She understood that she might be the only person in her village who was in a position to document what was happening. Most other residents had either fled, been killed, or become too frightened to observe and record events. Her testimony might be the only evidence that would survive to tell the story of what had happened to her community. As winter deepened and the conflict intensified, Maria Petrov had transformed from a frightened elderly woman into a crucial witness to history. She did not know it yet, but her carefully hidden records would eventually become some of the most important evidence in war crimes investigations, helping to ensure that those responsible for destroying her village would face justice. Winter brought new horrors to Sloviansk. The fighting intensified as opposing forces struggled for control of key positions around the village. Artillery barrages became a daily occurrence, forcing Maria to spend most of her time in the cellar. The occupation forces, desperate to maintain their grip on the territory, became increasingly brutal in their treatment of civilians. The executions began in December. Maria watched from her bedroom window as soldiers dragged her neighbor, Mikhail Volkov, from his house in the early morning hours. Mikhail was a retired teacher who had been accused of signaling Ukrainian positions to artillery units. The evidence was laughably thin. Someone had seen him hanging white sheets on his clothesline, which the occupiers claimed was a coded message to enemy forces. They shot Mikhail in the town square as an example to others. Maria documented every detail in her hidden diary: the time of the execution, the names of the soldiers involved, and the reactions of other villagers who were forced to watch. She noted that the commanding officer, who called himself Colonel Petrov, seemed to take particular pleasure in the killing. 2 days later, they came for Anna Sidorenko, an elderly woman who had been caught listening to Ukrainian radio broadcasts on a small transistor radio hidden in her attic. The soldiers accused her of gathering intelligence for enemy forces. Anna protested that she was only trying to hear news about her son, who was serving in the Ukrainian military, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. Maria was forced to watch this execution as well, along with the remaining villagers. The occupiers wanted everyone to understand the consequences of resistance, real or imagined. As Anna's body fell to the ground, Maria felt something inside her harden into cold determination. These crimes would not go unpunished if she had anything to say about it. The systematic documentation of atrocities became Maria's obsession. She recorded not just the major events like executions and torture, but also the smaller details that revealed the character of the occupation. She noted how soldiers stole food from hungry families, how they destroyed personal possessions out of spite, and how they used rape as a weapon of intimidation. The information gathering was becoming more sophisticated. Maria had learned to recognize different units by their insignia and equipment. She could identify individual soldiers by their faces and mannerisms. She began tracking their patrol schedules and noting their weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Most importantly, she started to piece together the command structure of the occupation forces. Through careful observation and eavesdropping, she learned the names and ranks of key leaders. She discovered that many of the so-called local separatists were actually foreign fighters who spoke with Russian accents and carried equipment that was not available to Ukrainian forces. The work was incredibly dangerous. Maria had several close calls when soldiers almost discovered her observation activities. Once she was watching a weapons shipment arrive at the town square when a patrol returned unexpectedly and nearly caught her at her window. Another time, she was photographing military vehicles with an old film camera when a soldier noticed her and demanded to know what she was doing. She claimed to be taking pictures of the snow for her family and somehow convinced him to let her go. But the greatest danger came from within the community itself. As conditions worsened and food became scarcer, some villagers became increasingly willing to inform on their neighbors in exchange for small favors from the occupation forces. Maria realized that people she had known for decades could no longer be trusted. The betrayal that nearly cost her life came from an unexpected source. Vera Kowalski had been Maria's friend for over 30 years. They had worked together in the local school kitchen, attended the same church, and supported each other through the deaths of their husbands. But desperation had changed Vera into someone Maria no longer recognized. In January, Vera approached Maria with a proposal that made her blood run cold. The occupation forces were offering rewards for information about resistance activities, and Vera suggested that they could make up stories about other villagers to collect these payments. When Maria refused to participate in such schemes, she could see suspicion growing in Vera's eyes. A few days later, Maria noticed that she was being watched more closely by the occupation forces. Patrols began passing by her house more frequently, and soldiers started asking her neighbors questions about her activities. She realized that Vera had probably reported her as a potential security threat. The situation reached a crisis point when soldiers arrived at Maria's house with orders to conduct a thorough search. They claimed to have received information that she was hiding weapons or communication equipment. Maria's heart pounded as they tore through her rooms, looking for evidence of resistance activities. Fortunately, her security measures held up. The soldiers found nothing incriminating because Maria had become expert at hiding her materials. Her diary entries were buried in waterproof containers throughout her garden. Her photographs were hidden inside the walls of her chicken coop. Her maps and observations were concealed in places that would never occur to the searchers. But the search was a clear warning. Maria understood that she was now on the occupation force's suspect list, and that any future activities would have to be even more carefully planned and executed. She also realized that her time in the village might be running out. The breakthrough that would change everything came in February, when Katya returned with news that stunned Maria. The information she had provided during their first meeting had reached international investigators, who were building cases against the leaders of the occupation forces. Her testimony was being used to document systematic war crimes and crimes against humanity. Even more importantly, Ukrainian military forces were planning an operation to retake the village. Intelligence officers needed detailed information about the positions and strength of the occupation forces, and Maria's observations were exactly what they required. "You have become one of our most valuable sources," Katya told her. "The information you have provided has already helped save lives in other villages. Now we need your help to liberate your own community." Maria felt a mixture of pride and terror. For months she had been documenting crimes with no clear idea of how the information would be used. Now she learned that her work was contributing to a larger effort to defeat the occupation and bring the perpetrators to justice. But she also understood that the most dangerous phase of her mission was just beginning. As Ukrainian forces prepared their offensive, the occupation forces would become increasingly paranoid and violent. Any mistake on her part could result in immediate execution. Katya provided Maria with new communication equipment a small radio transmitter that could send coded messages to Ukrainian forces. She also gave her specific intelligence requirements: troop movements, weapons positions, supply schedules, and defensive preparations. The liberation of this village depends partly on the information you can provide, Katya explained. But I want you to understand that we cannot guarantee your safety. If you are discovered, we will not be able to help you. Maria accepted the mission without hesitation. After months of feeling powerless and victimized, she was finally being given a chance to strike back against the forces that had destroyed her community. The risks were enormous, but the potential rewards, freedom for her village and justice for the victims, made those risks worthwhile. As Katya disappeared into the night, Maria began preparing for the most dangerous phase of her secret war. She would need to gather intelligence while avoiding detection, communicate with friendly forces while maintaining her cover, and survive long enough to see her village liberated. The elderly woman who had once been dismissed as just another victim of war was about to become a crucial player in the battle for her homeland's freedom. The radio transmissions began in March, when the first signs of spring were appearing in Maria's battered garden. The small device Katya had given her was no bigger than a cigarette pack, but it represented a lifeline to the outside world that Maria had not possessed for almost a year. Each night she would hide in her cellar and send coded reports about the occupation force's activities. The intelligence work required her to take risks she had never imagined. Maria began venturing out during curfew hours, moving through the shadows to observe military positions and count personnel. She learned to read the serial numbers on weapons and vehicles, information that helped Ukrainian intelligence identify the units they were facing and track the flow of equipment from across the border. The occupation forces had established their main command post in the old municipal building, converting the basement into a communications center and the upper floors into quarters for senior officers. Maria discovered she could observe this facility from the abandoned grain elevator on the edge of town, a dangerous climb that took her through several checkpoints and patrol routes. During one of these reconnaissance missions, Maria witnessed something that made her blood boil with rage. Through the windows of the municipal building, she could see occupation officers interrogating prisoners in what had once been the town clerk's office. The prisoners were clearly civilians. She recognized several faces from her neighborhood, and they were being tortured for information about resistance activities. Among the victims was young Dmitry Kozlov, whose family had lived next to Maria for 15 years. Dmitry was only 19 years old, a university student who had been home visiting his parents when the occupation began. The soldiers accused him of being a Ukrainian intelligence agent, a ridiculous charge since Dmitry was studying literature and had never shown any interest in politics or military affairs. Maria watched in horror as the interrogators used electric shock devices on Dmitry, demanding that he confess to activities he had never committed and provide information he did not possess. The young man's screams echoed through the building, and Maria had to cover her mouth to keep from crying out in sympathetic anguish. She documented every detail of what she witnessed, including the names and faces of the torturers. This information would eventually help prosecutors identify specific individuals responsible for war crimes, but at the moment it served mainly to fuel Maria's determination to see these monsters brought to justice. The intelligence gathering was becoming more systematic and professional. Ukrainian forces were providing Maria with specific requests for information: the exact location of artillery positions, the schedules for supply convoys, the identities of collaborators who were providing information to the occupation forces. Each piece of data she collected brought the liberation of her village one step closer, but the work was also becoming more dangerous. The occupation forces had increased their security measures, conducting random searches and setting up additional checkpoints throughout the village. Several residents had been arrested on suspicion of espionage activities, and Maria knew it was only a matter of time before suspicion fell on her. The close call that nearly ended her mission came in April, when a new security officer arrived to investigate suspected intelligence leaks. Captain Volkov was a professional counterintelligence operative who brought a level of expertise that the previous occupiers had lacked. Within days of his arrival, he had identified several security vulnerabilities and begun implementing new procedures to catch potential spies. Volkov's investigation focused on a series of incidents where Ukrainian artillery had struck occupation positions with unusual accuracy. He correctly suspected that someone was providing targeting information to enemy forces, and he began systematically investigating anyone who might have had access to the relevant intelligence. Maria realized she was in serious danger when Volkov's men began questioning her neighbors about her daily activities. They asked about her movements, her visitors, and any unusual behavior they might have observed. Maria could see that several people were willing to provide information, either out of fear or in hopes of receiving rewards. The situation became critical when Volkov announced that he would be conducting personal interviews with all remaining village residents. Each person would be questioned individually about their loyalty to the occupation forces and their knowledge of resistance activities. Anyone who failed to provide satisfactory answers would be detained for further investigation. Maria's interview was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late April. She spent the previous night destroying the most sensitive materials in her possession and preparing cover stories for any suspicious activities that might have been observed. She practiced her responses to likely questions and rehearsed expressions of loyalty to the occupation forces that made her stomach turn. When the time came, Maria presented herself at the municipal building with the demeanor of a frightened elderly woman who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. She told Volkov that she was too old and sick to care about politics, that she spent her days tending her garden and trying to survive until the war ended. "I have heard reports that you have been asking questions about our operations," Volkov said, watching her face carefully for signs of deception. "Some people say you are too interested in things that do not concern you." Maria forced herself to appear confused and slightly offended. "I am just an old woman trying to grow vegetables," she protested. "What would I know about military matters? I can barely understand why you are all fighting." Volkov pressed her with more specific questions about her movements and activities, but Maria's cover story held up. She had been careful to maintain a routine that appeared normal and innocent, even while conducting her intelligence work. Her reputation as a harmless elderly widow worked in her favor, as did her genuine lack of contact with other resistance members. After an hour of questioning, Volkov seemed satisfied that Maria posed no security threat, but as she was leaving, he issued a warning that chilled her to the bone. "I want you to understand that we are watching everyone very carefully," he said. "Anyone who helps our enemies will be executed along with their families. Even old women are not immune from justice." Maria nodded meekly and shuffled out of the building, but inside she was shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. The threat against families was particularly cruel, since it meant that her resistance activities could potentially endanger her daughter and grandchildren in Kiev. For several days after the interview, Maria considered ending her intelligence activities. The risks had become enormous, and she was no longer confident that her security measures would protect her. But then she received a message through Katya's network that changed everything. Ukrainian forces were preparing a major offensive to retake the entire region, and the liberation of Sloviansk was scheduled for early May. Maria's intelligence had been crucial in planning the operation, and military commanders were requesting one final set of observations about the occupation forces' defensive preparations. The message also contained news that gave Maria new motivation to continue her dangerous work. International prosecutors had issued arrest warrants for several occupation force leaders, including Colonel Petrov and Captain Volkov. The charges were based largely on evidence that Maria had provided, including her detailed documentation of executions, torture, and other war crimes. Knowing that her work was contributing to real justice for the victims gave Maria the courage to continue despite the risks. She began her final intelligence gathering mission, focusing on the occupation forces' preparations for the expected Ukrainian offensive. What she discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The occupation forces were clearly expecting an attack and had begun preparing defensive positions around the village. But their preparations revealed significant weaknesses that Ukrainian forces could exploit. Most importantly, Maria learned that the occupiers were planning to use civilian hostages as human shields during the fighting. They had identified several locations where they would force villagers to remain during the battle, hoping that Ukrainian forces would hesitate to attack positions where innocent people might be killed. This information was crucial for Ukrainian military planners. who needed to develop strategies that would minimize civilian casualties while still achieving their objectives. Maria's intelligence allowed them to plan precision strikes that would neutralize key targets, while avoiding areas where hostages were being held. But gathering this information required Maria to take her greatest risks yet. She had to infiltrate the municipal building to observe planning meetings, climb the grain elevator during daylight hours to photograph defensive positions, and even follow patrol routes to understand the occupation force's tactical plans. During one of these missions, Maria nearly walked into a trap. She was photographing a weapons cache hidden in the old church when she heard soldiers approaching. There was no time to escape, so she hid behind the altar and listened as the soldiers discussed their orders to shoot anyone found in the building. For 2 hours, Maria crouched in the cramped space behind the altar, barely breathing as soldiers searched the church around her. At one point, a flashlight beam passed just inches from her hiding place. She was certain that discovery meant immediate execution, but somehow the soldiers missed her. When they finally left, Maria was shaking so badly that she could barely operate her camera. But she forced herself to complete the mission, gathering the intelligence that Ukrainian forces needed to plan their assault on the weapons cache. The final transmission came on May 3rd, when Maria sent detailed maps showing the location of every defensive position, weapons cache, and command post in the village. She also provided a complete list of civilian hostage locations and the schedules for changing guards at key facilities. That same night, she received confirmation that Ukrainian forces would begin their offensive within 48 hours. After almost a year of occupation, liberation was finally at hand. But Maria also understood that the next few days would be the most dangerous of her entire mission. As the occupation forces prepared for battle, their paranoia and brutality would reach new heights. Any mistake on her part could result in immediate execution, just hours before freedom arrived. She would need to survive the final phase of the occupation, while maintaining her cover and protecting the evidence she had gathered. The woman who had started this journey as a helpless victim was now a crucial intelligence operative whose work would help determine the outcome of the battle for her village. But her greatest test was still ahead. The bombardment began at dawn on May 5th, with the thunder of Ukrainian artillery echoing across the fields surrounding Sloviansk. Maria was in her cellar when the first shells struck the occupation forces' positions around the village perimeter. After months of careful planning, the liberation offensive had finally begun. The opening barrage was more precise than anything Maria had witnessed during the months of occupation. Ukrainian gunners were targeting specific buildings and positions with remarkable accuracy, destroying weapons caches and command posts while leaving civilian areas largely untouched. Maria realized that her intelligence reports had made this precision possible. From her cellar window, she could see smoke rising from the municipal building where the occupation forces had established their headquarters. A direct hit had collapsed part of the structure, and she could hear soldiers shouting orders and running through the streets in confusion. The careful defensive plans that Captain Volkov had spent weeks preparing were being systematically destroyed by an enemy that seemed to know exactly where to strike. But the occupation forces were not giving up without a fight. As Ukrainian infantry began advancing toward the village, the occupiers implemented their plan to use civilian hostages as human shields. Soldiers began dragging families from their homes and forcing them into predetermined positions around key defensive sites. Maria watched in horror as her neighbors were herded at gunpoint toward the old school building, which the occupation forces had converted into a fortress. Among the hostages were several children, including 8-year-old Sasha Petrov, whose parents had been killed in an artillery strike months earlier. The boy had been living with his grandmother, and now both of them were being used as shields by the same forces that had orphaned him. The sight of innocent people being used as human shields filled Maria with rage, but it also confirmed the importance of the intelligence she had provided. Ukrainian forces knew exactly where the hostages were being held, which meant they could plan their assault to minimize civilian casualties. As the fighting intensified, Maria remained in her cellar, listening to the sounds of battle raging around her village. She could distinguish between the different types of weapons being used, the sharp crack of sniper rifles, the rapid chatter of machine guns, and the deeper boom of artillery strikes. Gradually, the sounds of combat began moving closer to the village center, indicating that Ukrainian forces were making steady progress. But the occupation forces had one final desperate card to play. As it became clear that their defensive positions were being overrun, several officers decided to implement a scorched earth policy. If they could not hold the village, they would destroy as much of it as possible before retreating. Captain Volkov personally led a team of soldiers through the residential areas, setting fire to houses and executing any civilians they encountered. Maria could see the orange glow of flames through her cellar window as her neighbors' homes were systematically destroyed. The smoke was so thick that it blocked out the morning sun, turning day into a hellish twilight. The sound of boots on her front porch told Maria that her own time had come. Through the cellar window, she could see soldiers approaching her house with gasoline cans and automatic weapons. After surviving almost a year of occupation and conducting a dangerous intelligence mission, she was about to be killed just hours before liberation arrived. But as the soldiers kicked down her front door, the sound of gunfire erupted from the street outside. Ukrainian forces had reached her neighborhood and were engaging the arson teams in fierce close-quarters combat. Maria could hear bullets whistling overhead and the shouts of soldiers from both sides as they fought for control of her street. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. From her hiding place in the cellar, Maria could hear the occupation soldiers in her house above, using her furniture to barricade the windows and firing at Ukrainian positions from her living room. Her modest home had become a battlefield, with bullets tearing through the walls and artillery shells exploding in her garden. Then suddenly, the house went quiet. Maria waited in the darkness, afraid to move or make any sound that might reveal her location. Had the Ukrainian forces won? Or were the occupation soldiers still above her, waiting for her to emerge so they could execute her? The voice that finally called down to her was speaking Ukrainian with an accent from Western Ukraine, not the Russian-inflected speech of the occupation forces. "Is anyone down there? This is the Ukrainian army. You are safe now." Maria climbed slowly up the cellar stairs, her legs shaking from hours of tension and fear. When she reached the main floor of her house, she found 2 Ukrainian soldiers standing among the wreckage of her furniture. Both were young men, probably not much older than her grandson, and they looked exhausted from the fighting. "Are you Maria Petrov?" one of them asked, consulting a piece of paper he pulled from his pocket. When Maria nodded, the soldier's face broke into a tired smile. "We have been looking for you specifically. Our intelligence officers want to thank you personally for the information you provided. Your report saved many lives during this operation." Through her broken windows, Maria could see Ukrainian flags being raised over the municipal building and the school where hostages had been held. The occupation forces were either dead, captured, or retreating toward the eastern border. After almost a year of suffering under brutal occupation, Sloviansk was finally free. But the liberation came with a terrible cost. As Maria ventured outside to survey the damage, she saw that much of her village had been destroyed during the final battle. Houses were burned, streets were torn up by artillery strikes, and many of her neighbors had not survived to see freedom restored. The old church where she had once hidden to photograph weapons caches was now a pile of rubble. The market where she had bought groceries for decades was completely destroyed. The school where she had worked in the kitchen was damaged but still standing, its walls scarred by bullet holes and shrapnel marks. Most heartbreaking was the discovery of mass graves where the occupation forces had buried many of their victims. Ukrainian investigators found the bodies of dozens of villagers who had been executed during the months of occupation, including many people that Maria had known personally. Her friend Anna Sidorenko, who had been shot for listening to Ukrainian radio broadcasts, was among the victims. As international journalists and human rights investigators arrived in the liberated village, Maria found herself playing a crucial role in documenting the crimes that had been committed. Her detailed diary, with its careful records of executions, torture, and other atrocities, became key evidence in war crimes prosecutions. The photographs she had secretly taken and the intelligence she had gathered helped investigators piece together exactly what had happened during the occupation. Her testimony was crucial in identifying specific individuals responsible for war crimes and in understanding the systematic nature of the violence that had been inflicted on civilian populations. But even as she helped build cases against the perpetrators, Maria struggled with the enormity of what she had witnessed and survived. The village she had called home for her entire life was physically and emotionally shattered. Many of her friends and neighbors were dead, and those who survived were traumatized by months of brutality and terror. The liberation was real and joyful, but it was also the beginning of a long and difficult process of healing and rebuilding. Maria had survived the occupation and played a crucial role in documenting its crimes. But now she faced the challenge of helping her community recover from one of the darkest chapters in its history. Her story was far from over, but the most dangerous phase of her secret war was finally complete. 6 months after liberation, Maria Petrov stood in the International Court of Justice in The Hague, her weathered hands gripping the witness stand as she faced a panel of judges from around the world. At 63 years old, she had traveled farther from home than ever before in her life. But her purpose was clear: to ensure that the crimes committed in her village would not be forgotten or forgiven. The courtroom was filled with lawyers, journalists, and human rights advocates from dozens of countries. Television cameras broadcast her testimony live to audiences around the globe. But Maria focused on the faces of the judges, the people who would decide whether the evidence she had gathered would lead to justice for the victims of Sloviansk. The prosecutor, a distinguished woman from Germany, guided Maria through her testimony with patience and respect. Together, they presented the detailed documentation that Maria had compiled during the months of occupation: photographs of weapons positions, records of executions, lists of torture victims, and maps showing the locations of mass graves. "Mrs. Petrov," the prosecutor asked, "can you tell the court why you chose to document these events despite the enormous personal risk?" Maria paused, thinking about all the friends and neighbors who had not lived to see this day. "Someone had to remember," she said simply. "Someone had to be a witness. If we did not record what happened, then these criminals would escape punishment, and our dead would be forgotten." The defense attorneys tried to challenge her testimony, suggesting that her observations might have been inaccurate or biased. But Maria's meticulous record-keeping and the corroborating evidence provided by other witnesses made her accounts virtually unshakable. Her diary entries, with their precise dates and detailed descriptions, painted a picture of systematic war crimes that was impossible to dismiss. One of the most powerful moments in her testimony came when she identified Captain Volkov, who was sitting in the defendant's dock just 20 feet away. This was the man who had tortured Dmitry Kozlov, who had threatened to execute her along with her family, who had overseen the murder of dozens of innocent civilians. "That is the man who ordered the execution of Anna Sidorenko," Maria said, pointing directly at Volkov. "I watched from my window as she was shot in the town square for the crime of listening to Ukrainian radio broadcasts." Volkov stared back at her with cold hatred, but he said nothing. The evidence against him was overwhelming, thanks largely to the intelligence that Maria had gathered and the testimony of other survivors who had been inspired by her courage to speak out. The trial lasted for 3 weeks, with Maria's testimony forming the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. When it was over, she had helped secure convictions against 7 occupation force leaders, including Captain Volkov and Colonel Petrov. The sentences ranged from 20 years to life in prison, and additional investigations were launched based on the evidence she had provided. But for Maria, the legal victory was only part of a larger process of healing and remembrance. After returning to Ukraine, she dedicated herself to rebuilding her village and preserving the memory of those who had been lost. The reconstruction of Sloviansk was a massive undertaking that attracted support from international organizations and foreign governments. New houses were built to replace those that had been destroyed, and modern infrastructure was installed to improve the lives of returning residents. But the emotional rebuilding was more complex and would take much longer. Maria played a central role in creating a memorial for the victims of the occupation. Working with architects and artists, she helped design a monument that would honor the memory of everyone who had died during those terrible months. The memorial included the names of all known victims, along with excerpts from Maria's diary that captured both the brutality they had suffered and their courage in the face of terror. The memorial was unveiled on the first anniversary of liberation, with hundreds of survivors and family members gathering to remember the dead and celebrate their freedom. Maria spoke at the ceremony, her voice strong and clear as she read the names of the victims and promised that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. "We survived so that we could tell their stories," she said to the assembled crowd. "We live so that the world would know what happened here, and so that justice could be served." In the years that followed, Maria became an internationally recognized advocate for war crimes documentation and victims' rights. She traveled to conferences around the world, sharing her experience and teaching others how to gather evidence in conflict zones. Her methods for hiding documents and maintaining security became part of training programs for human rights workers and journalists operating in dangerous areas. But she always returned to Sloviansk, where she continued to tend her garden and maintain the memorial to the victims. The apple trees that her grandmother had planted were damaged but still alive, and Maria carefully nursed them back to health. New vegetables grew in the soil where she had once buried her secret diary entries. The village itself was transformed by the experience of occupation and liberation. The residents who had survived developed a strong sense of community and mutual support that had not existed before the war. They understood that they had endured something terrible together, and that their survival was both a responsibility and a gift. Young people from around Ukraine and Europe came to Sloviansk to hear Maria's story and learn about the importance of documenting human rights abuses. She welcomed them into her home, sharing tea and vegetables from her garden while recounting the events that had changed her life forever. "People ask me if I'm proud of what I did during the occupation," Maria would tell her visitors. "But pride is not the right word. I am grateful that I was able to survive and to help ensure that justice was served. I am honored to be a voice for those who cannot speak for themselves." On her 70th birthday, Maria received a letter from her daughter Anya, who had moved back to Ukraine to be closer to her mother. The letter contained photographs of Maria's grandchildren, who were now old enough to understand their grandmother's story and take pride in her courage. "You showed the world that even in the darkest times, there are people who will stand up for truth and justice," Anya wrote. "You proved that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to resist evil rather than submit to it." As she read the letter in her garden, surrounded by the thriving vegetables and fruit trees that had witnessed her secret war, Maria reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a frightened elderly woman into an internationally recognized human rights advocate. The occupation had taken away her peaceful retirement, destroyed her community, and killed many of her friends. But it had also revealed reserves of strength and courage that she had never known she possessed. It had given her a purpose that extended far beyond her own survival, and a voice that could speak for victims around the world. Most importantly, it had proved that the human spirit could not be crushed by brutality and terror. Even in the face of overwhelming evil, individuals could choose to resist, to document, to remember, and to fight for justice. Maria Petrov had made that choice, and in doing so, she had helped ensure that the crimes committed in her village would never be forgotten and that their perpetrators would face the consequences of their actions. The woman they had counted as gone had not only survived, she had emerged from the silence to become one of the most powerful voices for justice in the modern world.